To those of you who received honors, awards, and distinctions, I say well done. And to the C students, I say you too can be President of the United States.
We have the worst president in America's history. He's ignorant, he's arrogant, he's stupid in all ways but one, which is he's immensely shrewd about the American people, particularly the less intelligent half of America, because they're very happy with him in that they realize how stupid he is, and they say to themselves, wonderful, if that stupid guy can be president, so can I.
We have elected a puppet for a president. Actually, we didn't elect him. He was appointed. His brother Jeb stole 50,000 votes in Florida, and his father's Supreme Court appointed him.
You know, if God has spoken to you and said you're going to be president, you don't have to worry about court decisions or recounts or things like that. All right, so he became president, but he didn't know why. And on September 11th, he discovered why.
This is my last stop on the way to Washington to serve as your president. I'm excited about the work. I'll come back to see you soon. God bless.
Nel gennaio 2001 George W. Bush lascia il nativo Texas per Washington. Ha appena vinto le elezioni presidenziali più controverse nella storia degli Stati Uniti. A 8 anni di distanza, George Bush e suo figlio George W. si succedono alla guida della nazione più potente del mondo, un evento senza precedenti nella storia americana. Tutti gli avvenimenti più importanti degli ultimi 12 anni si svolgono sotto la loro presidenza: il collasso dell'impero sovietico e del blocco comunista, la prima guerra del Golfo, l'11 settembre, la globalizzazione del terrorismo e la nuova guerra con l'Iraq.
They can pray for me, they can pray for my little girls. They can pray for my wife. They can pray for our family.
Let's do that. Let's do that together even now for this leader and all of them. Father, we ask you to bless our leaders, to direct our leaders, to redirect when necessary our leaders, to correct our leaders, to comfort them, to protect them and their families. God, we ask you to not only fill their hearts with love, but let them feel love from our heart toward them. I pray that this leader, our Governor Bush, will be one who never looks for the opportunity to strike out at someone, but rather to make a mark for good and a mark for right. Bless him and his family and protect him. In Jesus' name.
When he was asked in one of the presidential debates who he admired most as a philosopher or someone in history, he said Jesus Christ. He said it because he does admire his character, his principles, the practice of his life. He really had an encounter with God. He did acknowledge that he had battled with perhaps excessive alcohol and drinking. He not for a moment ever implied to me or publicly that he was an alcoholic, but he told me that it was a problem. And he said that faith and his relationship with God had changed his life.
He's the spoiled child of a rich family. And while he was growing up, he had an awful lot of fun. A lot of parties, a lot of girls, a lot of alcohol, normal story. At a certain point, he had a religious experience. God spoke to him. and said, prepare yourself, I have a mission for you. And he stopped drinking, and he stopped philandering.
He considers he turned himself around because of religion. And he deals with a lot of very conservative people, and they truly believe that they are right.
In un'intervista rilasciata a un giornale di Austin, Bush Jr. aveva dichiarato: «Sono investito di una missione divina, portare nella politica degli Stati Uniti una visione biblica del mondo». David Fromm, autore dei discorsi di Bush, ha visto il presidente nella stanza ovale raccontare ad alcuni membri delle chiese protestanti di come Dio l'avesse salvato dall'alcol.
He said, you know, I shouldn't be here, I should be on a bar stool in Texas, and I'm only here because of the power of prayer, because I found God.
The religiosity has a genuine quality to it. It has affected his life. He does feel it in a deep way. And a lot of born-again Christians who have met with Bush come away believing he is like them. He is them.
Everybody prays the first thing in the morning. They're believers. They're believers. And they pray in the White House.
In campagna elettorale, Bush aveva detto: «Solo chi crede in Gesù andrà in paradiso». E il ministro della giustizia Ashcroft aveva precisato: «Non abbiamo altro re all'infuori di Cristo». Alla Casa Bianca la sala del Consiglio dei Ministri somiglia ad una sala di preghiera, dove tra una lettura e l'altra dal Vecchio e Nuovo Testamento si gestiscono gli affari dell'America e del mondo.
When I entered the West Wing, the very first thing that I heard said was, you were missed at Bible study, because they would have, the evangelicals had a weekly Bible study, they had Christian fellowship, and the religion was very important to that staff and very important to that presidency.
I think Bush overdoes the religious aspect. It makes me uneasy, and I think it makes many Americans uneasy.
It is not true that George Bush goes down on his knees and asks God, what should I do? The idea that God gives him every morning an agenda, no, George Bush does not think like that, but he finds his source of strength in a religious faith.
I mean, this administration kowtows to religion, to extreme religion.
Bush's strongest, his base, his strong base is the religious, conservative right wing.
Ed McAteer appartiene al movimento dei cristiani sionisti. Ha ritirato il suo sostegno a Bush Jr. perché non vuole più Dick Cheney come vicepresidente. Le ragioni sono sorprendenti.
Bush says that he's against homosexuality, yet he picked a vice president whose daughter is a lesbian. Now, I tell people, I said, I'm not blaming the father for that, but George Bush knew that when he picked him, and so during the Republican convention that was played over and over, that lesbian girl, and she's seen all over the country, people know that.
All of this is disturbing to many people, but it happens to be a fact that the president is part of the Christian right.
Il fondatore di Moral Majority, Jerry Falwell, aveva puntato il dito su pagani, gay e lesbiche, moralmente responsabili, a suo parere, degli attentati dell'11 settembre. Bush aveva dichiarato: «Invochiamo la saggezza e la presenza di Dio in ciò che stiamo facendo. La crociata contro il terrorismo richiederà tempo».
Cette droite chrétienne a une politique étrangère, soutien à Israël, parce que ce sont des gens qui savent se battre, et aussi parce qu'il y a une teinture très anti-musulmane chez ces gens-là.
We had Boykin, General Boykin, who is now head of intelligence at the Pentagon, who was preaching in his uniform like a born-again Christian on a crusade against Islam. General Boykin and the president think the same way.
It's not Osama bin Laden. It's not what you can see. It's the enemy in the spiritual realm.
I mean, we've got Boykin showing people slides over Mogadishu back when the Black Hawk Down incident occurred, saying that here in the slide, that's the devil you're seeing, that's Satan flying over.
Ladies and gentlemen, that's not a fake. Whether you understand it or not, it is a demonic spirit.
What it was a Predator aircraft taking pictures. But he tells people that. This is head of U.S. intelligence. So, in the Pentagon. I mean, what do you say to that?
They believe in God, and they believe in a mission. They believe in a crusade against evil.
I think Muhammad was a terrorist. I read enough of the history of his life, written by both Muslims and non-Muslims. that he was a violent man, a man of war.
If we are in harmony with God, then we should love people. If Islam is in contact with some spiritual force, as they claim to be, would that spiritual force want to annihilate everyone that disagreed with them? Well, that would be another Hitler, a white supremacist. I mean, this is terrible thought.
I don't hate the Arab people. I got Arab friends. I love them. But I'm a Bible believer. And see, God gave that land to Abraham, to the Jew. And I use a little cliche saying that every grain of sand on that little piece of geography called Israel belongs to the Jewish people.
Up to 60 million people that identify themselves with the Christian right believe that the state of Israel must exist at the end of history. And that's how we're all going to go to heaven. If it doesn't exist, if it's overrun by Muslims, we're going to go to hell.
Potrebbe sembrare un raduno a Gerusalemme, ma in realtà siamo nel Colorado più profondo. Nessuno dei presenti è ebreo, né sul palco né tra il pubblico. Siamo alla riunione annuale della Coalizione Cristiana d'America. A migliaia in questo salone acclamano Israele. Sostengono lo Stato israeliano perché lo credono fondamentale per il trionfo della cristianità, nonostante considerino il popolo ebraico spiritualmente cieco per aver rifiutato Gesù. Al termine della grande battaglia finale tra bene e male, molti ebrei si convertiranno al cristianesimo, mentre i non credenti moriranno e saranno dannati in eterno.
They are the most unrestrained, total supporters of Israel that you can find in the world. There's a much higher percentage of American Christian evangelicals that support Israel than of American Jews, believe me.
You have an alliance in the United States, which is a very important alliance. It's not on paper, it's a de facto alliance between the Christian right and the Israeli lobby. There's a direct alliance there, and it's a rather unusual alliance, the first time I've seen it in my lifetime.
Le apparizioni di Ariel Sharon di fronte ai cristiani sionisti furono accolte da ovazioni degne di una rock star. Per loro, Sharon è il prescelto da Dio per il compimento delle profezie sulla fine dei tempi.
With God's help and your solidarity, we will win. We will win.
Prime Minister Sharon has been received 9 times by President Bush for private meetings, which is more than any other leader in the world.
Welcome, Mr. Prime Minister. Glad you're here.
The only way to understand American foreign policy in the Middle East is to understand that Israel is an integral part of the American body politic. And just taking it one step further, to explain to Arabs how they can possibly relate to what we're doing in the Middle East, is to think of Israel as the 51st American state. As a matter of fact, we treat Israel better than we treat most American states.
Ma è a Washington, tra i neoconservatori, che la destra israeliana ottiene un sostegno incondizionato. Questo piccolo gruppo di intellettuali, giornalisti e ricercatori si è introdotto nei gangli vitali del potere americano. Il loro guru è il sottosegretario alla difesa Paul Wolfowitz. Da quando Bush si è insediato alla Casa Bianca, loro fanno il bello e il cattivo tempo. I neocon detengono tutto il potere.
Pour eux, je crois qu'il n'y a pas de contradiction. Ce qui est bon pour Israël, et je dis plutôt pour la droite israélienne, est bon pour les États-Unis et vice-versa.
Paul Wolfowitz is a man who found a champion or a cause in Israel and in neoconservatism, and he knows nothing else. And therefore, his personal satisfaction and glorification is wrapped up in abusing American power.
Nel 1998 il Comitato per la sicurezza e la pace nel Golfo aveva indirizzato una lettera aperta al presidente per spingerlo a intervenire in Iraq. Terminava con queste parole: rovesciare Saddam è nettamente nell'interesse degli Stati Uniti. Tra i firmatari Paul Wolfowitz e Richard Perle.
Ils sont ou bien au Pentagone avec Wolfowitz, ou bien autour de Cheney. Et ça fait une petite équipe extrêmement homogène.
It's a mistake to lump together as one view Paul Wolfowitz and Richard Perle. Richard Pearl has his own views that he's exercised outside the government.
Paul is, of course, an extremely important official as Deputy Secretary of Defense. Richard is merely a private citizen who occasionally gives advice through various advisory boards.
Richard Pearl is a conniving, self-serving individual who has manipulated personal relationships into a position of undue power. I think he is one of the 3 most dangerous people in the United States.
Richard Pearl è una delle figure più in vista tra i neocon. Pur non occupando alcun ruolo ufficiale, ha un ufficio al Pentagono accanto a quello di Donald Rumsfeld e ha libero accesso a tutte le informazioni confidenziali. Il New Yorker ha scritto: Pearl gode di potere e influenza, prende decisioni senza rendere conto a nessuno, un privilegio che tutta Washington sogna e gli invidia. La stampa, che lo definisce principe delle tenebre per la sua predilezione a tramare dietro le quinte, afferma che è incontrollabile e provocatore, ma che gioca un ruolo essenziale accanto al presidente.
Oh, no, not at all. I'm sometimes amused to see stories about how influential I am in the White House. I have not seen President Bush since the day he took office.
We may have influence of a certain sort. We may help people understand the world, but we certainly don't have any direct effect on making policy.
I don't understand why this is such a mystery to so many people. It's portrayed as a conspiracy. It's nothing of the sort.
The people around Bush are not stupid. They're very smart. They are very calculating and manipulative. They're not deaf or dumb in any sense of the word. And Bush is not blind as much as he's inattentive.
I don't think he understands the situation. I don't think he understands the history. I think it would require, he's a uniquely incurious man.
I don't think he reads a lot, but I think he talks a lot to people, and he depends a great deal on what people tell him for his information.
He is a quick learner. He is able to find out which people have the knowledge that I need, and then he uses them.
He soaks up information like a sponge. And he is willing to ask questions, or was then willing to ask questions, that made it very clear there was a lot he didn't know, but he wanted to know.
I just don't think that Bush 43 is a geopolitical thinker. He doesn't know too much about the world, which is not his fault. He simply did not travel.
I mean, Bush didn't have a passport until he became president. How in God's name can he know about foreign policy or foreign countries? He didn't visit any foreign countries. He knows Texas, he knows Maine, where he takes vacation with his father, and then he has these people who were friends with the family.
The people who are the core of his staff in the White House were the people who were the core of his staff in Texas, and this is very unusual. He spent 6 years with these people in Texas, watching how they all got along with one another. And it was in Texas, where the national media were not watching, where whatever fights people had, they had them back in 1995 and 1996.
So Bush does surround himself, as I say, with these very sharp, intelligent people. And to a great extent, then, of course, they manipulate him.
Richard Pearl, Doug Feith, Bernard Lewis, the academic, Wolfowitz, all of them come in there and they say, this is the way the world is. I mean, how would you ever know?
It's not that we are an influence on the president. It's that the president's own thinking is rather similar to ours.
Les conservateurs ne s'intéressent pas beaucoup à la politique intérieure. Eux, c'est vraiment la puissance de l'Amérique, le rôle de l'Amérique dans le monde.
If one is a hawk because of a readiness to use force when it is the only thing that has any reasonable chance of success, then okay, I am guilty as charged.
We are obliged, within the limits of our capacities, within the context of sort of reasonable possibility, to support democratic revolution everywhere, always. That's what we are.
They believe that they brought down the Soviet Union, okay? They really believe it. Richard Pearl, Wolfowitz, everybody at the Reagan administration, they believe they took the place down. And so they're saying, well, if we can do it in the Soviet Union, why not bring down all these evil empires in the Middle East? They're very clear about this. They were talking about it's time to reform the Middle East. And one of the things they wanted to do was crush Saddam Hussein for the benefit of Israel.
Qui avait par-dessus le marché ce rêve d'une transformation du Moyen-Orient pour que les gens hostiles aux États-Unis ou à l'Occident soient éliminés.
And Iraq was the country for which we were best prepared because we had been at war with Iraq since 1990. And we had military options, and we thought we knew a lot about the country, and we were prepared to do that.
All they were doing was they needed a pretext. That's all they needed.
Until September 11th, George W. Bush had no program. September 11th comes and imposes on him a mission.
C'est une catastrophe qui se produit et qui en même temps est très utile aux gens au pouvoir. Parce que quand le 11 septembre s'est produit, l'équipe de Bush était au pouvoir depuis à peu près 9 mois et pataugeait.
9/11 defined his presidency. 9/11 is the day on which he discovered who he was and what he had to do.
Our war on terror begins with Al-Qaeda, but it does not end there. It will not end until every terrorist group of global reach has been found, stopped, and defeated. I have a message for our military. Be ready. I've called the armed forces to alert, and there is a reason. The hour is coming when America will act, and you will make us proud. May God grant us wisdom, and may He watch over the United States of America. Thank you.
If President Bush had come to Congress on the 20th of September 2001 and said, I am here today to talk about these terrorist attacks, and I think we must re-examine the faults in our own foreign policy that have brought us to this position. And while we will certainly do our best to arrest the people who did these terrible deeds, we must also remember that we have a work of conciliation and appeasement to do in the Middle East, and above all, we must settle the Israeli-Palestinian dispute. If he had said that to Congress and the American people, they would have impeached him. He wouldn't have gotten out of the room alive.
C'est le lendemain du 11 septembre qu'un certain nombre de membres de l'administration du côté du Pentagone sont venus trouver le vice-président pour lui dire c'est le moment de renverser le régime de Saddam Hussein.
They made a decision on 9/11 that this was the excuse they needed to go in and finish up Saddam Hussein.
That was the plan. And this administration was indeed waiting for a pretext. General Clark has said publicly that on 9/11, as American couples were holding hands and jumping to their death, the White House called him and said, pin it on Iraq. They weren't thinking about the Americans dying. They weren't thinking about the people who were committing suicide in order to escape the flames. They were thinking about 9/11 not as an attack, but as a gift.
Do it. They had the opportunity. And linking Al-Qaeda and Hussein was a lie, but that isn't what they wanted to do.
Era stato il vicepresidente Cheney a convincere Bush della necessità di un'azione militare contro l'Iraq. 12 anni prima aveva adottato la stessa posizione come segretario alla difesa durante la prima crisi del Golfo. Paul Wolfowitz fu altrettanto convincente con Donald Rumsfeld, l'attuale segretario di Stato alla difesa. Aveva ottenuto per sé il posto di vice segretario per tenere d'occhio Colin Powell, come aveva detto a Rumsfeld. Il 17 settembre tutta la squadra si riunì nel ranch presidenziale per mettere a punto il rovesciamento di Saddam Hussein.
There was discussion about Iraq right after September 11. I don't believe a decision was made at that point.
Paul Wolfowitz started talking up Iraq. Iraq is the real culprit. Well, I mean, how can Bush decide whether it's the real culprit or not? If Paul Wolfowitz tells him that it is, you trust Paul Wolfowitz.
I think the inclination was there with Cheney. I think it is very clear Paul Wolfowitz pushed every opportunity he had to suggest that we should engage in regime change.
It's quite true that Wolfowitz was for invading Iraq very early.
There may be circumstances in which we know that we are about to be attacked, and in those circumstances, if we can prevent that attack by striking first, of course we should do that. It's perfectly normal.
If they'd come to the American people and said, look, we want to engage in a war of conquest, in effect, to reestablish the balance politically in the Middle East, I don't think people would have gone along with it.
The president basically has let the public believe a lie, which is that Iraq played a role in 9/11, which is nonsense.
But he's done that entirely on his own. It's not that he's been unduly influenced by a small group of people.
Believe me, the people who perpetuated this lie, the neoconservatives around Bush and the others, knew all that. They knew what effect it was having on the public.
But I think what September 11th showed is if 19 people using nothing more than conventional airliners can kill 3,000 people in one day, and we start to look at the weapons that those people were exploring even on September 11th, and the potential for groups like that ultimately to inflict not 3,000 in one day, not 30,000, but 300,000 or maybe 3 million, then you realize this is not an evil we can continue to live with. It's an evil that has to be eradicated.
Lisez les discours de M. Bush, de M. Cheney, de M. Rumsfeld, tout au long de cette période avant la guerre en Irak, mais après le 11 septembre. C'est très subtil. La première phrase, on parle de Saddam Hussein. La deuxième phrase, on parle du 11 septembre. La troisième phrase, on parle de Bin Laden. On ne les lit pas vraiment explicitement ensemble, mais pour ceux qui écoutent plus ou moins, les trois phrases se mélangent et se mêlent, et l'idée est là, au niveau de la conscience du peuple américain, qu'il y a un lien entre ces trois faits et ces trois événements.
Le président est revenu plusieurs fois sur les liens entre Al-Qaïda et Saddam Hussein. 18 journalistes ont posé des questions, une sur les rapports entre le président et le Seigneur, et 15 autres sur l'Irak. Pas un n'a soulevé le problème du lien entre Al-Qaïda et Saddam Hussein. Ils ont avalé ça totalement.
I've never believed that from the very beginning. Why would Saddam Hussein risk being involved with Al-Qaeda? He has no record of trusting terrorist groups. He's played with them, but dictators in the Middle East don't trust terrorist groups.
I don't see how you could deny it. And you know, for Richard Pearl, here's this guy, I was on TV with him. He said this in public. That bastard Saddam Hussein was responsible for September 11th. When he knew very well that there was no basis for this story, and started this myth about Saddam being behind September 11th. There's just no evidence.
A fine dicembre, il presidente Bush affida a David Frum l'incarico di scrivere il discorso dello Stato dell'Unione. Bisognava colpire l'opinione pubblica, trovare l'equivalente della celebre definizione che Reagan diede dell'URSS, l'impero del male.
In that original draft, the phrase was axis of hatred. But writing for the President of the United States is very much like writing for a major Hollywood film production. You write your words and then they go into a gigantic bureaucratic process and you revise and you work with others. He's like a character in a movie and you think of him that way. What would George Bush say about this? And you try to absorb the way he thinks, the way he communicates, his values, his feelings, so that you can answer for him what he would say if he had the time. And I was asked, if the president wants to take the war beyond Afghanistan, how would he explain to the American people why he is doing what he is doing? Could you come up with an example of how we could speak? So I wrote a section, like a page or two, on that question. And my material then became the basis of the section of the speech that dealt with Iraq.
Our war against terror is only beginning. Iraq continues to flaunt its hostility toward America and to support terror. The Iraqi regime has plotted to develop anthrax and nerve gas and nuclear weapons for over a decade. This is a regime that agreed to international inspections, then kicked out the inspectors. This is a regime that has something to hide from the civilized world. States like these and their terrorist allies constitute an axis of evil, arming to threaten the peace of the world. By seeking weapons of mass destruction, these regimes pose a grave and growing danger. The price of indifference would be catastrophic.
And it really rested on one principle, that Saddam Hussein possessed real, significant weapons of mass destruction now, today. Not that he was building them, not that he wanted them in the future, not that he had them in the past. It was that he had them today.
We know that Saddam built weapons of mass destruction. He used them. And we know that he refused to explain what had happened to them.
These people came to their conclusions and then looked for intelligence to support it. And when they couldn't find intelligence to support it, they created lies to the American public, to the American Congress, to the United Nations, and to the rest of the world. They lied to the world.
Per 18 mesi tutto il governo continua a martellare sullo stesso concetto. L'apocalisse è alle porte.
There is no doubt that Saddam Hussein now has weapons of mass destruction. There is no doubt that he is amassing them to use against our friends, against our allies, and against us.
Our enemies have declared this very intention and have been caught seeking these terrible weapons.
We're talking about anthrax. We're talking about botulinum toxin. We're talking about nuclear weapons programs.
It clearly would be unhelpful if terrorists got their hands on some of Iraq's chemical or biological capabilities.
It is a shell game played on a grand scale with deadly serious weapons.
Is trying to shake the will of America and the civilized world. And this country will not be intimidated.
What he wants is time, and more time, to husband his resources, to invest in his ongoing chemical and biological weapons program, and to gain possession of nuclear weapons.
The United States of America will not permit the world's most dangerous regimes to threaten us with the world's most destructive weapons.
C'est ça qui est inquiétant, de voir avec quelle facilité une propagande bien organisée, répétitive, enfonçant le même clou dans les têtes, à quel point ça peut être efficace.
This administration has chosen to use the propaganda tools of Hitler and Göring and Goebbels.
Mais quand même pas en régime nazi. Mais quand même, quand Goebbels disait que si on répète un mensonge assez souvent, les gens l'avalent, il n'a pas tort. Et c'est ça qu'on a vu se produire à ce moment-là.
We have to scare the hell out of the people of the United States. I think Bush and Cheney, and I don't approve of this, I think Bush and Cheney were engaged in scaring the people, trying to unite public opinion.
This was necessary for him to convince the public that this was an issue, this was a problem, this was a threat that had to be dealt with immediately. And there was no time to try any other alternative courses of action.
Over the years, we've tried limited strikes against military facilities. It didn't work. We've offered Iraq the path of voluntary disarmament and inspections. The Iraqi regime is rejecting it.
He said the UN inspectors had concluded that there were massive stockpiles of weapons, of chemical weapons and biological weapons. Now the problem with all this is there was no evidence to back it up. The UN inspectors never said that.
La strategia della Casa Bianca si dispiega in due tempi. Il primo obiettivo è sbarazzarsi degli ispettori ONU che si ostinano a non trovare tracce di armi di distruzione di massa e a farlo sapere al mondo. In secondo luogo, bisogna dimostrare che quelle armi esistono. Wolfowitz e Rumsfeld si accaniscono su Hans Blix, capo della commissione di controllo degli armamenti, per screditarlo. Trascinato nel fango, Blix finisce per lasciare e rientra a Stoccolma. Ma prima, in un'intervista al Guardian, usa un linguaggio molto poco diplomatico contro tutti quelli che al Pentagono mi hanno insozzato, facendo correre sul mio conto voci incredibili. Quei bastardi, li apostrofa in inglese, mi hanno perseguitato per 3 anni.
Perhaps I had not
really thought that that particular word was as strong in American English as it was. I had heard it many times in my student days in England and didn't think it was so hard. But maybe I should have used another word. Maybe I should have said skunk.
I think the drivers of this are at the top levels of the Defense Department, people like the hawks like Wolfowitz. I mean, these are people who in whose interest it was to see Blix discredited.
There was a fairly severe, you might say, smear campaign by media.
We cannot wait for the final proof, the smoking gun, that could come in the form of a mushroom cloud.
The London Times had an article in which their New York correspondent suggested that I should turn the smoking gun on my own head.
C'était ignoble. C'était ignoble parce que c'était un homme d'une grande honnêteté.
They did so for a reason, I suppose, and that was that they felt they might not have convinced their constituents, their parliaments, or the Congress to go to war simply by saying that we suspect. That would not have been enough.
If Americans believed Blix, we wouldn't have gone to war when we did. So Americans had to not believe Blix.
They probably had many other reasons too why they wanted to go for Saddam. Mr. Wolfowitz has said that the choice of weapons of mass destruction as a reason was a bureaucratic one, that this was one that everybody could agree on. It was a hyping, I think. It was a spin. It was very hard to see that the Iraqis were terribly dangerous in the year 2002 and 2003. The vice president gave some speeches in August of 2002 in which he did not conceal that he thought inspections were useless at the best. And I think Mr. Wolfowitz was of the same view.
Now, Colin Powell, who is supposed to be the smart one in this administration, is the one, I remind everybody, who stood up before the United Nations and claimed there are weapons of mass destruction.
Iraq declared 8,500 liters of anthrax, but UNSCOM estimates that Saddam Hussein could have produced 25,000 liters.
He had gone through the evidence, so he took responsibility for what he said. And it's quite clear that not all of what he said there really held water.
How much longer are we willing to put up with Iraq's noncompliance before we, as a council, we as the United Nations say, enough, enough? Saddam Hussein and his regime are busy doing all they possibly can to ensure that inspectors succeed in finding absolutely nothing.
It's a little like the witch hunting in the Middle Ages. That, you are convinced there are witches. Well, then you look out and you find them. And here too, they were convinced that there were weapons of mass destruction. And therefore you are inclined to interpret anything as evidence of that.
Every year the United Nations said, stop, tell us what you're doing, and they did not. Well, finally, President Bush, Prime Minister Blair, and Mr. Berlusconi, Mr. Aznar, and many other leaders in the world said this has to come to an end.
The problem is you really shouldn't be going to war, a preemptive war, based on a suspicion or a belief. I mean, you should have some proof. I mean, there was no proof. That's the point.
This is clearly totally unsatisfactory, that the world's biggest governments can go ahead on the basis of such information.
I saw a former Jordanian prime minister for dinner, and I said, what if we don't find the weapons of mass destruction? And he said to me, you'd better invent them.
Eliminato Blix, resta ora da dimostrare che Saddam si è procurato uranio arricchito per fabbricare armi nucleari. Ma è necessario che a fare certe affermazioni sia una persona irreprensibile. La Casa Bianca propone il nome di Joe Wilson. Intimo della famiglia presidenziale, era stato l'ultimo diplomatico americano ad aver incontrato Saddam a Baghdad. Per il coraggio mostrato durante la guerra del Golfo era stato decorato da Bush padre. È Cheney che incarica la CIA di contattare Wilson per una missione molto delicata.
Joe Wilson was a very able ambassador, gave money to Bush 1. And Wilson was called by the CIA to go to a country whose people he knew and check out a rumor that the country of Niger had sold yellow cake, which is a material you'd use in part of nuclear weapons production, to Iraq. The neocons around President Bush, had been citing this including Cheney, had been citing this as a reason to invade Iraq.
Je leur ai dit au moment où on a pris la décision que j'irais, mais seulement comme représentant du gouvernement, c'est-à-dire comme quelqu'un qui pose des questions de la part de mon gouvernement, pas du CIA. Je ne suis pas espion.
So he went and he talked to several government officials and asked them how they, what type of business they do with uranium, what are the safeguards, what are the protections, and came back and said that it was, in his view, unlikely that such a deal could happen.
J'ai fait mon rapport qui disait que non, il n'y avait rien derrière cette histoire.
To Wilson's great shock, even though he had learned that, the speech that the president gave in the State of the Union, which is the most important speech an American president can give, cited this thing, saying it was true.
The British government has learned that Saddam Hussein recently sought significant quantities of uranium from Africa.
Nous savions par les rapports qui ont été faits, y compris le rapport que j'ai fait, que ces informations étaient fausses.
Bush is either a liar or he believes it and doesn't know it's not true. Either is bad. Either disqualifies Bush as president.
On ne peut pas dire que c'était les Anglais. On doit carrément dire que c'est quelqu'un dans la Maison-Blanche qui avait mis dans son discours quelque chose qui ne pouvait pas être justifié.
Well, Wilson was just appalled by it because he knew it wasn't true. The people at the CIA also knew it wasn't true.
They had told the White House before that this was wrong. This started a gigantic fight with CIA people leaking all over the place against the White House.
C'est une question, c'était sur lequel ils ont basé la décision d'aller à une guerre non seulement en guerre, mais de faire une guerre qui était l'invasion, la conquête et maintenant l'occupation d'un pays souverain.
That's when Joe Wilson got very upset.
And so he decided to write an op-ed piece for the New York Times describing this experience he had. Well, the political people in the White House were angry. And the way they dealt with this is they decided to leak the story to 5 different organizations, all friendly news people that had dealt with them in the past. The one organization that took it was Robert Novak, the conservative columnist.
He calls one of his contacts at the White House. The White House is trying to diminish Joe Wilson and says, oh, and by the way, you know, his wife is with the CIA, and she's the one who had the idea of sending him to Niger.
And he ran the story mentioning Joe Wilson's wife's name, which is a federal crime. Joe Wilson's wife was a covert operative for the operations directorate of the CIA. And when you mention one of those names, mention a spy's name, you endanger her.
Regardez un peu ce qu'ils ont fait. On a compromis tout ce qu'elle a fait depuis 20 ans. Parce que ce n'est pas seulement la personne, c'est toute sa carrière qui est mise en question. Toutes ses relations avec des étrangers. Tout ce qu'elle aurait dû faire pour son pays depuis le temps qu'il a été l'océan.
That's one of the worst things I've ever heard of anyone doing in the White House.
The story was ruining her career, but also undermining her work.
Every operation she was ever involved with, every country she ever visited, would now become the target of opposing forces in those countries. So a lot of people's lives were put in danger when he did that.
L'idée de prendre un membre de la famille d'un adversaire pour essayer de la discréditer en espérant qu'en la discréditant, on allait discréditer l'adversaire même, c'est complètement, c'est idiot ça. C'est éthiquement pas admissible.
The leak is now being investigated in this country, but it's believed to have come from somebody at the White House, either in the Vice President's office or the President's office.
It's hard for me to believe that would have been orchestrated by Bush.
I suspect that the President of the United States, the appointed President of the United States, is completely clueless about this and many other things. I believe that these individuals who worked for Dick Cheney, the FBI has now established who it was, they worked for Dick Cheney, and I believe that they acted independently perhaps of Cheney's guidance, but with his complete protection.
C'était lui qui était le demandeur du rapport que j'ai fait. Et c'est lui qui était avec le président quand on a fait l'analyse et le revue du discours de l'État de l'Union. C'est lui qui restait le plus dur sur la question des armes nucléaires, même après qu'il a reçu non seulement mon rapport, mais tous les autres rapports. Donc je trouve qu'en effet, il est malhonnête dans ses discours. et dans ses efforts de menacer les Américains et de créer une sorte d'état de peur.
Alla Casa Bianca, George W. Bush evita ogni confronto con la stampa, restando senza parole.
President Bush said nothing. He didn't address this. He didn't say, I'm outraged. This is terrible. He didn't say, I want an investigation. He didn't say to his staff, you tell me whether you did this or not. I want you to sign a piece of paper saying you didn't do it. I mean, he did nothing.
C'est net et clair que c'était un prétexte. Ils ont fait la guerre à Bagdad pour refaire la carte politique du Moyen-Orient. Pure, net et simple.
In un congresso così discreto da dare l'impressione di un regime a partito unico, il decano del Senato Robert Byrd pronunciò il discorso più duro mai sentito contro un presidente americano. La cosa sorprendente è che Byrd è un amico personale di Bush padre e di Ronald Reagan, ma ha 85 anni e non ha più nulla da perdere.
There's no debate. There's no discussion. There's nothing. Nothing. The idea that the United States or any other nation can legitimately attack a nation that is not imminently threatening, but which may be threatening in the future. The idea that the United States may attack a sovereign government because of a dislike for a particular regime is a radical new twist on the traditional idea of self-defense. This administration has turned the patient art of diplomacy on its head, turned the patient art of diplomacy into threats, labeling and name-calling of the sort that reflects quite poorly on the intelligence and sensitivity of our leaders and which will have consequences for years to come. Calling heads of states pygmies, labeling whole countries as evil, denigrating powerful European allies as irrelevant. In only the space of 2 short years, this reckless and arrogant administration has initiated policies which may reap disastrous consequences for years. Will we seize Iraq's oil fields? Becoming an occupying power which controls the price and supply of that nation's oil for the foreseeable future? There are some who think so. Frankly, many of the pronouncements made by this administration are outrageous. There's no other word. And yet this chamber is hauntingly silent. Silent.
Come out! Come out! Open the door! Open the door! Get your hands up and come outside! Come outside! Everybody in the house needs to come outside! Out here in the yard, out here in the yard. Keep going, keep going, keep going, keep going.
No one there, no one. No one in there? No one.
Let's start, sir.
Yeah, clear the house now. Let's sweep on down straight.
Keep going.
Il Centro per la Pubblica Integrità è un piccolo gruppo di volenterosi che ha lanciato l'allarme contro la nuova America di George W. Bush, che sta sacrificando le libertà individuali sull'altare della guerra contro il terrorismo. Il centro rivelò che il ministro della Giustizia, John Ashcroft, stava mettendo a punto in gran segreto il Patriot Act 2, che conferiva alle autorità nuovi poteri di controllo non soltanto sulle frontiere e sui cittadini stranieri, ma sugli stessi americani.
This is our democracy, for God's sake.
The Patriot 2 Act, Ashcroft and his aides kept that legislation from the public and from their own Republican chairmen of the Judiciary Committees in the House and Senate for half a year. They never told them they were planning new legislation. They never showed them the legislation. And when we obtained the legislation, everyone, including Republicans in Congress, were utterly astonished because no one told them.
It was simply just an internal circulation that was unfortunately disclosed in an unauthorized manner prematurely, really, to the public.
What is that about? When did we start developing secret legislation that changes our rights and liberties?
We're constantly challenging ourselves with ideas, some of them crazy, some of them stupid.
This is not the United States of America. There's something very odd. Whatever we think of the substance of that legislation, that's inappropriate.
We supervise a workforce of 168,000 persons. Some of those persons will make mistakes. USA Patriot Act 2 was more of a think piece.
This new law that I signed today will allow surveillance of all communications used by terrorists, including emails, the internet, and cell phones.
On peut demander à n'importe quelle bibliothèque publique de communiquer la liste des livres qu'empruntent leurs clients.
They simply get a subpoena from a criminal grand jury in order to obtain such records from businesses, including libraries and bookstores, if they have evidence relevant to a criminal investigation.
They can spy on anybody. They can get your phone records. They can get your credit card records. They can find your library books you read. They will go after you, and they do it. And they do it quite proudly.
L'operazione TIPS si basava su un numero verde a cui era possibile denunciare i comportamenti sospetti o i propositi sovversivi di amici, vicini e parenti, il tutto in perfetto anonimato. Ashcroft dichiarò: "Abbiamo messo il sistema sottosopra, ma si trattava di un'emergenza nazionale."
People have an obligation to contribute to the protection of that freedom, of that security.
We are asking all U.S. citizens to come forward to the FBI with any valuable information they have to help us apprehend terrorists or to stop terrorist attacks.
The idea was that they were going to have mailmen, people who read meters for the electricity and the gas, anybody who sees anything that they think is suspicious, to call and report people into the government.
Because they know best who is out of place, who looks suspicious, and it is no more than simply a reporting of suspicious activity to the law enforcement authorities.
The last country that did this, that I know about, was the Soviet Union, where you had people that would, in your apartment block, who would rat on you if you had the wrong book, or if you had, and that's what they were trying to create here, and that's what TIPS was. When Americans start pointing the fingers at other Americans, saying you're no good, you're a communist, you're a red, you're this, you're that. Well, now it's you're an Arab, you're Al Qaeda, but whatever it is. When we start doing all this, we're kind of becoming what we're supposed to be fighting. You know, I mean, this is the kind of stuff the Taliban did. So now we're going to do it? We're going to say, well, we want to know what you read, we want to know what you do, we want to know what you say, what you buy, what you rent, who you see, who you have dinner with. This is not America.
They've got no Arab students there because they can't pass the visa exam. Friends of mine are being stopped at the border and asked to provide certificates from the police department that they're not criminals.
Tre stati e 235 città annunciano che non applicheranno quelle leggi sul loro territorio. Contestano la nuova legislazione, mettono in guardia contro le derive della lotta antiterrorismo e accusano il governo di abuso di potere. Ma Cheney non batte ciglio. Queste misure, dichiara, faranno parte di una nuova normalità.
I am always constantly afraid of Big Brother, of George Orwell. Those kinds of activities can quickly turn ourselves into a Gestapo state.
Won't come easily to America, but it could come here. It could come here because fascism finally is the deterioration of democracy as well as the upsurge of an autocratic, oppressive notions of government. And it can come from either direction. Democracies can crumble, and oppressions can become so powerful that you can call them fascisms.
We are going after these people, and we are going to prevail in court, I hope, I believe, because they are hiding the truth.
L'altra preoccupazione del centro è la lotta alla corruzione e agli immensi profitti generati dalla guerra.
Bush and Cheney are the first time that we've had two businessmen, two oil executives become president and vice president. This is utterly unprecedented in U.S. history. There are certain companies, dozens and dozens, hundreds of companies that are getting phenomenally, obscenely rich. And guess what? 2/3 to 3/4 of those companies give their campaign contributions to the Republican Party and to George W. Bush in incredible gratitude for this wonderful time they're having. And all of it is in the name of national security. And while we have a flag in the background and we put our hand over our heart and say the Pledge of Allegiance, we're getting rich.
This administration is behaving like pigs at the trough. They're saying, we want it all. We want to take it all. We went in there, we got them out, and we're now going to take all the business.
Dick Cheney said, well, you know, unfortunately, God put oil in certain countries and you can't control that.
Il vicepresidente Dick Cheney era stato ai vertici della Halliburton, numero 1 al mondo nei servizi petroliferi. Fu una filiale della Halliburton la prima a proporre un lavoro a Bush padre nel 1948. Il Washington Post ha rivelato che con Cheney al timone la Halliburton ha continuato a commerciare con l'Iraq nonostante l'embargo. Una settimana prima di assumere la carica di vicepresidente, Cheney lasciò la compagnia con circa $45 milioni in stock option di buonuscita.
This has been a bonanza period for the company. They're doing quite well, thank you very much. And having your former president and CEO as the vice president obviously has not hurt one bit.
Halliburton, Dick Cheney's company, effectively stole $61 million since April. I find that astonishing. And everybody knew it. Anybody who deals in Iraq knows that gasoline was being sold at enormous margins.
It seems to be that they bought the petrol for €1 and sold it for $3. It's outrageous.
Nobody had a chance to bid. And then we're told that Halliburton then, in turn, after it gets $600 million, will put up other contracts, subcontracts to bidding. So it struck us as a little dubious.
Well, I think this is part of a very small, organized mafia that is taking advantage of the American public.
Look, they're all crooks. You know, every contract in Iraq today is tailor-made for Kellogg Brown Root, which is Cheney's company, it's a subsidiary of Halliburton. You can't go into Iraq unless you deal with an American company.
Il gigante degli armamenti Lockheed Martin ha relazioni privilegiate con l'amministrazione Bush. Lynn Cheney, moglie del vicepresidente, siede nel suo consiglio d'amministrazione.
Mrs. Cheney, being on the corporate board of a company getting federal government contracts and not resigning immediately when her husband took power as vice president is highly unusual. In fact, I don't know of a single time in U.S. history, not in any recent half century that of contemporary America, where the spouse of a vice president was getting money from a corporation getting government contracts. It's such an obvious conflict of interest. It is so obviously inappropriate. And what is most incredible to me is when news reports of that connection surfaced, she had a very defiant response. Basically, you can all go to hell. I will continue to serve on this board.
Tutti i principali collaboratori di Bush, come del resto lui stesso e suo padre, sono legati a doppio filo all'industria degli armamenti e del petrolio. Karl Rove, consigliere di primaria importanza, era stato azionista della Boeing, l'azienda che costruisce bombe ad alta precisione, gli elicotteri Apache e i missili Tomahawk. Paul Wolfowitz, numero 2 del Pentagono, era stato consulente della Northrop Grumman, i cui cacciabombardieri F-18 sono stati usati in Iraq. Donald Rumsfeld e Colin Powell erano ai vertici della Gulfstream Aerospace Corporation, Hanno ottenuto una buonuscita di $1 milione ciascuno. Rumsfeld era anche nel CDA della ABB, che aveva venduto centrali nucleari alla Corea del Nord. Il New Yorker ha rivelato che Richard Pearl era tra i soci della Trireme. Con Pearl al Pentagono, la compagnia ha raccolto $45 milioni, la metà dei quali provenienti dalla Boeing.
Come on, the guy writes an article in the Wall Street Journal, but forgets to tell the reader that he took $20 million for Boeing.
Clearly making money from his close association with the president. The president did not have any problem with this. He didn't rebuke Pearl publicly.
Well, it's starting to look like a third world republic, isn't it? Banana republic.
Nel giro di 2 anni, la Northrop Grumman, primo fornitore dell'esercito americano, ha aumentato le sue vendite del 60%, la Boeing del 30% e la Lockheed Martin del 25%. Il Los Angeles Times ha scritto: mai nessuna presidenza ha permesso che accadesse un decimo di quello che è accaduto sotto Bush.
We know where this war is going. Halliburton, Bechtel, Lockheed, Boeing. We know where this war is going.
Multinational corporations have no ethics. They will deal with the devil himself if they can make a profit.
Col diavolo, la famiglia Bush ha fatto anche affari.
You mind if I peek at some of the family photos?
There he is. Here's his swearing in as the 41st president. And this is an interesting picture. This is 3 generations of Bushes: Senator Bush, President Bush, and President Bush.
Prescott Bush, nonno di George W., aveva avuto un'illustre carriera di banchiere, era diventato un rispettabile senatore repubblicano e giocava a golf con Eisenhower prima che il suo passato riemergesse.
Well, it's an interesting family. Prescott Bush was the grandfather, the patriarch of the family. And Prescott Bush in the 1940s had an interesting role. He was an investment banker for Brown Brothers Harriman. Unfortunately, at the very same time he was doing those things, he was the secret banker for Adolf Hitler and the Thyssen family. And he moved money for the Nazis. While his son was fighting them in the Pacific, fighting their allies in the Pacific, Dad was home doing that.
Le imprese di Prescott Bush furono sequestrate dal governo per cooperazione con il Terzo Reich e commercio con il nemico. Una delle sue società sfruttava miniere in Polonia che impiegavano prigionieri dei campi di concentramento come manodopera.
About a week ago, the records showing Prescott Bush's connections to the Hitler government were released in the National Archives. Do you know there wasn't one story about that on any television network?
You know, I don't think the public really ever has looked that closely at the Bush family today or in the past.
10 anni prima della guerra nel Golfo, Bush padre, allora vicepresidente di Ronald Reagan, aveva assicurato il sostegno USA all'Iraq nella guerra contro l'Iran. Allora Bush e Saddam erano grandi amici.
I wouldn't have called him a friend in particular. We had relations with the Saddam Hussein regime, just like we've had relations with any number of tyrannical regimes around the world. We tried to moderate his behavior.
George Bush, when he was vice president of Ronald Reagan, actually set up Saddam Hussein, actually backed him, actually put him into power, and his envoy in all this was then in private citizen the Secretary of Defense Donald Rumsfeld. He actually went to see Saddam and then came back and recommended we support him.
We created Saddam Hussein, just like we created bin Laden. The United States of America creates its own enemies.
It was blowing up in our face, and we didn't know it, and we were too stupid to see it. And that is the legacy of George Bush's father.
The idea was to keep the war going as long as possible so they would destroy each other. It was astonishingly cynical and Machiavellian.
There was some modest cooperation between the United States and the Saddam Hussein regime. It is simply not correct to say we gave them massive supply of weapons. We gave them some intelligence on order of battle information.
We were willing to give Saddam Hussein anything in the world to hurt the Iranians.
Bob Woodward del Washington Post racconterà come la CIA fornisse agli iracheni immagini satellitari per meglio calibrare i loro bombardamenti. Per più di 4 anni Saddam ha avuto accesso ai metodi americani di raccolta delle informazioni e ha imparato a conoscerli.
The CIA helped the Iraqis by providing not satellite photography, I don't believe, but with the information off of satellite photography. Yes, the CIA cooperated with Saddam Hussein in 1984. We know that.
They did give satellite photography. I mean, it was the CIA that helped win the war for Saddam. They informed the Iraqis, the United States government, when there was going to be an attack.
We were providing direct intelligence support, including signals intercepts, not just imagery. And the bottom line is we chose to support Iraq over Iran, and we were willing to overlook genocide on Saddam's part.
The United States tilted a little bit toward Iraq. That is not a policy that I liked very much. I didn't participate in that policy.
Come vice di Reagan, Bush padre finanziò e armò Saddam. Nel 1986, con un'operazione segreta, ceppi di antrace furono inviati in Iraq.
That we had given them anthrax? That's crazy. That's just absolutely untrue.
In fact, we prevented that. During the Reagan administration, the Pentagon stopped the shipment of anthrax. So, I mean, it may be that something or other got through, but policy was never to give any such thing to Iraq.
Nell'ottobre 92 un'inchiesta rivela che tra l'85 e l'89 erano state effettuate 60 consegne di colture biologiche ai laboratori di Saddam. Il gigante Bechtel, diretto oggi da George Shultz e Caspar Weinberger, entrambi in passato segretari di Stato di Reagan, fu scelto da Baghdad per costruire le fabbriche per la produzione di armi di distruzione di massa.
I remember it very well because I was writing about it in the newspaper at the time, criticizing Reagan and even more Bush, the father, for his administration helping Saddam Hussein after the use of chemical weapons against the Kurds. I thought it was clear what Saddam Hussein's intentions were and that we needed to oppose him, not help him. And Bush the father read those articles, denied them, has never forgiven me for writing them.
We were fully aware of it. Our ambassador knew it. Our military advisors to him knew it. Colin Powell, who was visiting, knew it. A number of people knew it. And we still supplied aid to him. So 10 years later to say that he's a terrorist, he's this guy and that, because he used poison gas, is absolutely disingenuous and ridiculous.
Sam Gwynn dirige il Texas Monthly. È l'autore di una serie di articoli e di un libro sulla dinastia Bush, 4 generazioni di scandali e complessi intrecci finanziari trasmessi di padre in figlio, come i rapporti di Bush padre con i Bin Laden sin dagli anni 70. I Bush sono il primo clan politico americano coinvolto in maniera inestricabile con le famiglie reali medio-orientali e il loro denaro. I principi dell'Arabia, i Bin Laden e i Bush sono spesso stati soci in affari. La famiglia del futuro capo terrorista ha finanziato indirettamente la carriera di George W. Bush.
I don't know if there's a Bush dynasty, but Bush and his son have been much too willing to sell out the American interest to those who pay them.
Well, the father, the moment he left the White House, he goes off to Saudi Arabia to do business for the Carlyle Group, where he's a consultant.
It is what they call in America the revolving door in Washington, where you go, you know, you suddenly one day you're in the Defense Department, like Frank Carlucci, and then suddenly you're then out working for a company that has business with the Defense Department.
Carlyle è il più importante fondo di investimento del paese e vanta oggi un attivo di 16 miliardi di dollari. È stato creato e diretto da Frank Carlucci, vice direttore della CIA e ministro della difesa con Reagan. Lo affiancano molti ex del Pentagono, della CIA e della Casa Bianca. Ma Carlyle è molto più di un semplice fondo di investimento. Molte sue attività sono legate al settore della difesa. La sua consociata United Defense Industries costruisce i carri armati impiegati in Iraq e i missili per le navi americane.
And all we know is that people leave the government and for some reason they work for the Carlyle Group. But what value do they add? It's like the mafia, it's a small family, And Carlucci was the head of it.
There's nothing mysterious about Carlyle. We're a private equity house, basically owned by the partners, of which I am one. We invest in companies, we buy companies. We probably control 17 or 18 European companies, mainly in the engineering area.
And on the advisory board, you have George H.W. Bush. I don't know how we distinguish him, 41. H.W. Bush, James Baker, the former Secretary of State, Frank Carlucci. These people are all major Bush-era politicians.
Some of our companies do deal with government. We have a company that does security clearances for the Air Force. We have a company that builds some of the armored vehicles for the Army.
This is historically unprecedented. We have never had a former U.S. president helping a defense contractor during a time of war, and we've never had this odd circumstance of that happening while the former president's son is a sitting U.S. president. I mean, this is an extraordinary, utterly peculiar situation.
But they don't call it corruption, they call it business. Did you ever see The Godfather? It's just business.
L'11 settembre 2001 alle 9 del mattino all'hotel Ritz-Carlton di Washington si apre l'assemblea annuale degli investitori del Carlyle Group. La riunione è presieduta da Frank Carlucci. Al suo fianco Shafiq bin Laden, fratello di Osama, che rappresenta la famiglia bin Laden nel gruppo.
You know, top officials from the former administrations, the Bush administration, were meeting with the Carlucci group and bin Laden family on the 11th of September in a nice hotel. Everybody was friendly. They were talking about business.
Like everybody else who was an investor, they were entitled to attend the investor conference. It was entirely a matter of their choice.
So it's interesting at this, you have bin Laden. There's two bin Ladens, I guess.
It was a brother of bin Laden that was meeting with the Carlyle group. Yeah, he was the head of the bin Laden group.
Anybody who, as I say, who had invested in Carlyle was able to attend.
They were actually sitting there when the airplanes hit the World Trade Center and then shortly after the Pentagon.
It is correct that in September 11th of that year, we were having an investor conference when the attack on the World Trade Center took place.
My guess is that Carlyle has severed all its connections with the bin Laden family since September 11th. The problem is that at the highest levels of government, the implications of Saudi policy were not understood.
The Bush family's very good friend, Prince Bandar, their ambassador here, arranged for chartered planes, while no Americans were allowed to fly, to pick up all the members of the bin Laden family and other Saudis and take them home.
The only jet allowed to fly in the United States the day after 9/11. It picked up all of bin Laden's family members and flew them immediately to Saudi Arabia. I mean, if I were the US government, I would have let him pick up all of bin Laden's relatives, and then I would have put them immediately into detention and interrogated all of them.
We far too long accepted the Saudi version of reality that they sell to us and ignored what's really going on in that country.
The Saudis spend more money in Washington than almost any other government. They put the money around in law firms and lobbying groups, and they put the money into campaigns.
That paid for Colin Powell to go to Tufts University to give a speech for 15 minutes. And how much did he get for going to Boston? $200,000, plus a first-class ticket. You know, like the next week he became Secretary of State. That was Saudi money.
We have essentially been whores, political whores, for the Saudis for the last 40 years.
This is a country that has been buying off people for years. They buy off people, they buy off lobbyists and lawyers on K Street here in Washington. They buy off politicians by hiring them as advisors, by investing in their children's companies as they did with the Bush family.
George W. Bush, the President of the United States, was saved by Saudi Arabia on several occasions.
If they made direct investments in U.S. political campaigns, that's illegal. So they have to find intermediaries to do that with.
We have allowed the Saudis, in the name of cheap oil, to rape and cheat and deceive the American public.
You know, when you have this sort of dependence on money, it's very difficult, as any dependence, to criticize, the source of your money.
Il problema degli oscuri legami tra Stati Uniti e l'Arabia Saudita venne sollevato dal francese Laurent Muriavec in una riunione a porte chiuse tenuta al Pentagono. Questo falco duro e puro, ex consigliere del ministro della difesa francese, è molto vicino a Richard Perle, suo mentore.
Richard Perle m'a invité au Defense Policy Board pour qu'on lance un débat interne à l'administration sur l'Arabie Saoudite. J'étais personnellement extrêmement honoré que mon pays d'adoption me demande à moi, français, de venir au Pentagone, au Defense Policy Board, participer à l'élaboration de la politique des États-Unis.
It created a bit of an explosion when there were newspaper accounts of what had been said in that briefing.
Il y a eu une fuite. Le contenu de mon briefing est apparu en première page du Washington Post et ça a créé un énorme scandale puisque jusqu'alors la question saoudienne était une question taboue.
Il rapporto di Muraviec era più che politicamente scorretto. L'analisi era di un'estrema durezza nei confronti del regime saudita. Vi si leggeva: l'Arabia Saudita, madre e nutrice del terrorismo, è l'avversario più pericoloso degli Stati Uniti. I sauditi sono attivi a tutti i livelli della catena terroristica, dal finanziamento all'esecuzione. Non sono che una sottotribù dei primitivi che si riproducono come conigli.
J'ai parlé des princes saoudiens qui pullulent comme le lapin en Australie, puisqu'il y a aujourd'hui aux alentours de 8000 princes saoudiens.
The portrayal he gave of Saudi Arabia was totally erroneous, and but he made it clear that he was speaking as an individual. It was not a Rand position.
But because it was said in a meeting of Defense Department advisors, it created a big explosion.
His subsequent behavior led to a determination by Rand that his services were no longer needed.
Pourquoi? Parce qu'il y a dans la Maison-Blanche et dans l'entourage de la Maison-Blanche des gens qui font partie de ce que j'appelle le lobby saoudien, qui est le plus puissant des lobbies étrangers à Washington. Et ce sont les gens que le président Bush a hérités, en particulier de son père, qui gardent une certaine influence dans l'administration. En particulier au département d'État, dont le chef Colin Powell fait lui aussi partie de ce lobby saoudien.
Bush porse subito le sue scuse al principe ereditario saudita. Queste opinioni non hanno niente a che vedere con le mie idee o con quelle del segretario alla difesa o del vicepresidente.
Bush a appelé le prince héritier Abdallah et j'ai perdu mon boulot. On m'a rapporté que Carlucci avait en gros exigé ma tête.
I did speak to the president of Rand Corporation, but the Rand Corporation conducted its own investigation and made its own determination.
Dopo 2 anni di inchiesta, il rapporto sull'11 settembre e sulle carenze dei servizi informativi è stato pubblicato dal Congresso. È un'accusa sferzante contro le disfunzioni dell'amministrazione, ma è stato privato della parte che riguarda le relazioni tra gli autori degli attentati e l'Arabia Saudita. Circa 30 pagine classificate top secret sono andate perdute.
Well, it wasn't lost, it was withheld by the executive branch, and I think probably because it would have revealed some things are very embarrassing about Saudi Arabia.
Les 28 pages du rapport du Congrès sur le renseignement et le 11 septembre ont été enlevées du rapport ou blanchies dans le rapport à la demande de l'exécutif.
I mean, I think that's all you need to know. I mean, I think the American public pretty much figured out the Saudis. Now, President Bush has defended them. What he's saying is they're our allies and that everything's fine and they're helping in the war against terrorism. The fact is he invaded the wrong country. If he wanted to fight the war on terrorism, he should have invaded Saudi Arabia, not Iraq. That's not where the war is, and that's not who funded terrorists. It's take the attention away from what really is the cause of these events and put them on Saddam Hussein. It was a diversion. Everything has been a diversion.
Una settimana prima di Natale, Bush riceve un regalo che ormai non si aspettava più. Le radio, le TV e la stampa fanno proprie le opinioni dell'amministrazione. L'opera delle agenzie di comunicazione che lavorano per il Pentagono è stata efficace. Fa eccezione una radio di Los Angeles che afferma: se l'informazione è l'ossigeno della democrazia, allora gli Stati Uniti stanno morendo asfissiati.
That was the right thing to do. Hussein is gone. A dictator is gone.
Yeah, but where is the anthrax? Where are the nuclear bunkers? Where are all this stuff? They were wrong, but they can't admit it.
The reality is he fooled us. He suckered us into a war in the Middle East based on very poor intelligence when there was no intelligence showing that they had weapons of mass destruction.
All these things that the CIA, that Colin Powell cited in his UN speech, these giant trucks moving around to these huge mobile weapons facilities, well, no one's found them.
If you ask the neocons, who said that they're weapons of mass destruction, Saddam was going to launch a nuclear war and all the rest of this stuff, they will tell you it doesn't matter. It was the morally right thing to do to go in. He was a bad guy.
Does anyone believe that we would never have seen weapons of mass destruction in the hands of Saddam Hussein if we had left him in place? I certainly don't.
This war was stupid. They wrote articles about it. You have the generals from the first Gulf War wrote articles about it. You have other generals. The Pentagon hates the war, the generals do. The soldiers do. It was all driven by the hawks, who are incapable of telling the truth.
Nobody would ask us to stand there and accept a strike that we knew was coming, particularly if it involved a nuclear weapon or a chemical or a biological weapon.
I don't think he realizes how unpopular America has become around the world. I really don't.
I realized better than most people what this war would involve. I think most people thought there would be tens of thousands of people killed, and it would be a long and very bloody war. I thought it would be over in 3 weeks with very few people killed. Now, who was right?
«700 morti e poco più di 3.000 feriti. Ma i media americani hanno seguito le direttive e non parlano più delle perdite. Le basi aeree dove ogni giorno arrivano i corpi dei soldati uccisi sono off limits per la stampa e le TV non riprendono più i funerali».
We're losing, a dozen Americans a week. And I'll tell you, if you drive up to Walter Reed Army Hospital and walk through the aisles up in Walter Reed Army Hospital and look at the kids who've lost arms, legs, who can't see anymore, who lost the lower half of their body, you'll understand what George Bush's war means.
Now, is that price worth paying to get rid of Saddam? And I say no, as bad as he was. I always said along, let the Iraqis find somebody else to replace him, somebody they can live with.
Now, there are some who say, turn sovereignty over right away. Well, to whom? And what power? Who would I turn it over to if I was going to go to Baghdad today and say, I'm turning over all sovereignty?
That was where the greatest folly was in the war. Democracy comes out of an inner impulse in a majority of the people in that country, one way or another, to change the way they live and have a more open and dignified life. You kind of bring it to them from outside.
The hawks will say if you turn the table over, it's good. You have democracy, you have civil societies, everybody will be happier, they'll accept Israel. They're pessimists like me saying you turn the table over and you get something much worse.
Neither Cheney, nor Pearl, nor Wolfowitz, nor Rumsfeld understood that 80% of that country is aligned with Iran, and that if we allowed free and democratic elections, we would get an Islamic republic.
I mean, the abysmal ignorance in this administration of the region is one of the most frightening things I've ever seen.
They don't deserve democracy by their own light. Indeed, they don't. They haven't fought for the democracy. In the case of Iraq, the only way a democracy could have come to that country is through a basic war against Saddam Hussein that they were able to win, which they've not been able to.
The way I look at it today is this war was unjustified. It wasn't justified in their eyes. It was a war against Arabs, against Muslims. And so that will be a huge pool of recruits for bin Laden.
If they don't know that going into it, you have to ask yourself, are these people qualified to manage the American Republic?
I think we will probably be looking at this history in a very dark way 4, 5, 10 years down the road.
A Crawford, nel Texas, si trova il ranch presidenziale di George W. Bush. È un villaggio di 500 abitanti percorso da una sola via centrale, come nei film western. L'arrivo di Bush ha segnato l'inizio di una rinascita. Le botteghe si sono trasformate in negozi di souvenir inneggianti alla gloria del presidente. Accanto a bibbie e fucili si trovano gadget con l'effigie di Bush, di cui tutti qui auspicano la rielezione.
George Bush truly does not realize the magnitude of his mistakes. He has been completely captured by his base, the neoconservatives, the evangelical Christians, and his big business campaign contributors.
This president has more money than God. I mean, we are seeing more money in the political process by one candidate than any time in U.S. history.
He's going to have $200 million to spend on the election cycle. His closest Democrat now has raised about $15 million. So you can see the disparity.
On the other hand, if casualties have mounted, we've had a mini Tet offensive in Baghdad in the middle of the presidential campaign, then it could look very bad for President Bush.
Defeat in Iraq will be a terrible historical and political defeat for George W. Bush personally.
If the resistance gets much worse, which they expect it to get much worse, what we should be doing is counting the number of body bags, how many dead Americans are coming back.
Several hundred Americans have lost their life there, and it doesn't look like Iraq is turning around. The American public is going to be, I think, skeptical about giving Bush another 4 years.
Every president is at risk in the United States. If you lose the confidence of the public, you go home.
Yeah, he could lose. Let's hope.
All'inizio di gennaio 2004, l'edificio eretto con cura dalla Casa Bianca comincia a sgretolarsi. Incalzato da un giornalista, Bush ammette ciò che aveva sempre negato.
We've had no evidence that Saddam Hussein was involved with the September the 11th.
A metà gennaio, un libro di Paul O'Neill, ex segretario al tesoro del presidente, rivela che la guerra era stata preparata molto prima dell'11 settembre e descrive Bush come un cieco tra sordi. O'Neill viene poi incriminato per aver consegnato alla stampa un documento intitolato Piani per l'Iraq del dopo Saddam, che risale al febbraio 2001. Qualche giorno più tardi, David Kay, incaricato dalla CIA di scovare le armi di distruzione di massa, torna a mani vuote. La sua equipe di 1400 ispettori ha setacciato l'Iraq senza risultato. Non è stata trovata la minima prova.
I wanted to call them and ask them if they'd tell me exactly where they were, since they seemed to be much more sure about their existence than those of us who were searching.
Il 20 gennaio Bush pronuncia il suo discorso sullo Stato dell'Unione appoggiandosi su Kay per rafforzare le sue affermazioni.
Already the Kay report identified dozens of weapons of mass destruction related program activities. Had we failed to act, the dictator's weapons of mass destruction programs would continue to this day. For all who love freedom and peace, the world without Saddam Hussein's regime is a better and safer place.
I resigned essentially one day after the State of the Union address. I thought the politicians should have been far more cautious about what they were saying. He should have said, in my view, we were wrong. He didn't. There is an obligation to frankly acknowledge error. All the Iraqis we were talking to, despite the fact that I had millions of dollars I could have rewarded them with, I could have provided them a palatial living place in the United States if they had taken us to weapons of mass destruction. In spite of all these incentives, no Iraqi had a story that said they had weapons or they had ever had weapons. We were all manipulated by Saddam Hussein. And I include myself during my days as inspector. I think he was bluffing. It turned out we were almost all wrong in terms of his actually having weapons. Most of his weapon stockpile, the pre-91, had been destroyed during the 90s. There is no evidence that he recreated large stockpiles of chemical and biological weapons, and his nuclear program was a very pale shadow of a large program in the 1980s. It almost didn't exist. The April 5th speech of Secretary Powell really looks a bit ridiculous now in terms of what we found.
Le dimissioni di Kay in piena campagna elettorale hanno l'effetto di una bomba. Powell dichiara: se avessi saputo quello che Kay ha detto al Senato, non avrei mai consigliato a Bush di avviare le ostilità. Il 5 febbraio il direttore della CIA, George Tenet, parla per la prima volta. Abbiamo sopravvalutato i progressi fatti da Baghdad nel nucleare, ma i nostri servizi non hanno mai parlato di una minaccia imminente.
The worst thing for a democracy is to suppress the truth in the interest of the election. The idea of preemptive military action every time you have a threat is a genuinely crazy idea. We went to war for the wrong reasons on the basis of a serious deception and error.
Bush ha finito per accettare la creazione di una commissione d'inchiesta indipendente sull'esistenza di armi nucleari e batteriologiche, il pretesto principale usato per giustificare la guerra contro l'Iraq. Ma i risultati non si sapranno prima del 2005, dopo le elezioni presidenziali di novembre.
Take away our PlayStations, and we are a third world nation under the thumb of some blue blood royal son who stole the Oval Office and that phony election. I mean, it don't take a weatherman to look around and see the weather. Jeb said he'd deliver Florida, folks, and boy, did he ever. And we hold these truths to be self-evident. Number one, George W. Bush is not president. Number two, America is not a true democracy. And number three, the media is not fooling me, 'cause I'm a poem heating hyperdistillation, and I've got no room for a lie so verbose. Yeah. Yes, I'm looking out over my whole human family, and I'm raising my glass in a toast. Here's to our last drink of fossil fuels. Give back the night its distant whistle. Give the darkness back its soul. Give the big oil companies the finger finally, and relearn how to rock and roll. Yes, the lessons are all around us, and the truth is waiting there. It's time to pick through the rubble, clean the streets, and clear the air. Get our government to pull its big dick out of the sand of someone else's desert. Put it back in his pants. Quit the hypocritical chants of freedom forever. 'Cause when one lone phone rang in 2001 at 10 after 9 on 911, which was the number we all call when that lone phone rang right off the wall, right off our desk and down the long hall, down the long stairs in a building so tall that the whole world turned just to watch it fall.